"You should have tasted what I made for your husband yesterday," said my daughter-in-law after tasting the cake I baked for my son's birthday. I never imagined I'd end up hiding tears in the kitchen on my son's birthday, feeling invisible in my own home. My daughter-in-law's words cut deeper than any knife could. "Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart." I'm 73 years old, and my name is Margaret. I live in a small one-bedroom apartment on the north side of Chicago, where the wind cuts through you like broken promises and the gray sky matches the color of my days. Every morning, I wake up at 5:30, not because I have to, but because sleep has become a stranger to me. The radiator clanks like old bones, and I wrap my late husband's burgundy cardigan around my shoulders, breathing in the faint scent of his aftershave that still clings to the wool after 3 years. My kitchen is barely big enough for 2 people, with chipped white cabinets I painted myself 20 years ago when hope still lived in my chest. The linoleum floor creaks under my feet as I make my morning coffee, always too strong because my hands shake now and I can never measure it right. On the windowsill sit 3 wilted African violets that I talk to like old friends, because sometimes they're the only ones who listen. That morning, the morning that changed everything, I stood in that tiny kitchen at dawn, flour dusting my fingers like snow. I was making David's birthday cake from scratch, the same chocolate recipe I'd used for 37 years. German chocolate with coconut pecan frosting, his favorite since he was 7 years old. My arthritic hands worked slowly, methodically, each stir of the batter a prayer that maybe this time, just maybe, he'd smile the way he used to. The way he did before life got complicated, before money became more important than memories, before his wife convinced him that his mother was just an obligation. I remember pressing my palm against the oven door, feeling the heat radiate through the glass as the cake rose. For 45 minutes, I allowed myself to hope. I pictured David's face lighting up, imagined him taking that first bite and saying, "Mom, this is perfect, just like always." I imagined Sarah, my daughter-in-law, maybe softening around the edges, remembering that I was once young too, that I once baked cakes with dreams instead of desperation. The apartment smelled like chocolate and vanilla, like the birthdays of my past when David would wake up early just to help me crack eggs, when his small hands would grip the wooden spoon with determination, when "happy birthday" meant something more than duty. I looked at the photographs lining my narrow hallway, dozens of them chronicling a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. David at 3, chocolate frosting on his nose. David at graduation, his arm around me, both of us grinning. David at his wedding, where I wore my best navy dress and smiled until my cheeks ached, even though Sarah barely acknowledged me in the receiving line. When the cake finished cooling, I frosted it with the patience of a woman who had nothing but time. Each swirl of the spatula was deliberate, loving. I arranged it on my mother's china platter, the one with tiny pink roses that survived the Depression, 2 moves, and 37 years of birthday cakes. My hands trembled slightly as I carried it to the table, and I whispered a small prayer to my husband's spirit, "Please, Robert, let this mean something." The text message came at 2 in the afternoon. "Thanks for the cake, Mom. See you soon." 12 words. 37 years of birthday cakes reduced to 12 words and an initial. No invitation to dinner. No request for my company. Just acknowledgement that the cake existed, like thanking the mailman for delivering the bills. I sat on my flowered sofa, the one Robert and I bought at Sears in 1987, and stared at that message for 20 minutes. The afternoon light filtered through my thin curtains, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor that needed refinishing but would never get it on my Social Security budget. I thought about calling David, hearing his voice, asking about his work at the investment firm downtown where he managed other people's fortunes while his mother counted quarters for the grocery store. But I didn't call. I never called anymore, not since Sarah answered his phone last Christmas and said, with that particular tone that wives perfect, "He's very busy right now, Margaret. Maybe later." Later never came. Instead, I took the L downtown to David's office, a gleaming tower in the Loop where men in $1,000 suits made millions in the stock market while I survived on $400 a month after rent. The elevator smelled like expensive cologne and ambition, nothing like the Old Spice and sawdust scent I remembered from Robert's workshop in our old house in Queens, the house we sold so David could go to Northwestern, the house where I'd raised my son to be kind and grateful. David's office overlooked Lake Michigan, and through the floor-to-ceiling windows, you could see sailboats dotting the water like white butterflies. He sat behind a mahogany desk that probably cost more than my annual income, his dark hair starting to thin at the crown just like his father's had. When he saw me in the doorway, his smile was automatic, professional, the kind he probably gave to difficult clients. "Mom, what are you doing here?" Not exactly the warmth I'd hoped for, but not cold either. Just surprised, like I was a puzzle piece that didn't fit in this particular picture. I brought your birthday cake, I said, holding up the carrier bag from Marshall Fields that I'd saved for special occasions. I thought maybe we could share a piece. He glanced at his computer screen, then at his phone, then finally at me. That's really sweet, Mom, but I have a conference call in 10 minutes. Rebecca and I are having dinner tonight anyway. Rebecca. He'd started calling Sarah by her middle name 6 months ago, something about sounding more professional for his career. Everything was about the career now, about the investment portfolios worth millions, about the Bitcoin transactions that earned him bonuses bigger than my yearly rent. Of course, I said, setting the bag on his desk beside a crystal paperweight that caught the light like frozen tears. Maybe this weekend? We'll see, he said, already turning back to his computer. Thanks for the cake, Mom. Really? Thanks for the cake, Mom. Really? The same words from the text message, delivered with the same casual dismissal that had become our normal conversation. I kissed his cheek, inhaling the expensive cologne that had replaced the cheap drugstore aftershave he'd worn in college when he used to call me every Sunday just to talk. That evening, I sat alone in my kitchen, cutting myself a slice of David's birthday cake. It was perfect, moist and rich, the frosting sweet and nutty just the way Robert used to love it. I ate it slowly, tasting 37 years of birthdays, 37 years of hoping that love could be measured in cups of flour and tablespoons of vanilla. The phone rang at 8 o'clock. David's voice crackled through my old landline, competing with the static that reminded me daily that I couldn't afford to upgrade anything in my life. Hey Mom, Sarah wanted me to tell you something about the cake. My heart lifted slightly. Maybe she'd enjoyed it. Maybe she'd recognized the hours of work, the love baked into every layer. She said it was good, David continued, and I could hear voices in the background, the clink of wine glasses, the sound of a dinner party I hadn't been invited to. But she wanted you to know that the chocolate cake she made yesterday was incredible. You should have tasted what I made for your husband yesterday, she said. She used this Belgian chocolate that costs like $50 a pound, and David couldn't stop talking about how amazing it was. The words hit me like ice water. Sarah's message, delivered through my son's voice, sharp and deliberate as a slap. You should have tasted what I made for your husband yesterday. Not my son. My husband. As if David belonged to her now, as if 37 years of birthday cakes were just practice for the real thing, the wife who mattered, the woman who could afford $50 chocolate. That sounds wonderful, I managed to say, my voice steady even though my hands were shaking. I'm glad you enjoyed both cakes. Yeah, well, I better go. We have people over. We have people over. Not, we're having a dinner party, or, some friends stopped by. We have people over, the kind of people who appreciated $50 chocolate, the kind of people who belonged in that world of crystal paperweights and lake views and Bitcoin investments that I would never understand. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for an hour, the overhead light casting harsh shadows on the empty cake plate. The message was clear, I was obsolete, a relic from a simpler time when love was enough, when effort mattered more than expense accounts. Sarah's $50 chocolate had erased my 40 years of birthday cakes with one strategic sentence delivered through my own son's mouth. I walked to my bedroom and opened the closet where I kept my memory box, a shoebox covered in faded contact paper that held the remnants of a life that felt increasingly distant. Report cards where David's teachers praised his kindness. Mother's Day cards made from construction paper and glitter. A photo from his 8th birthday where he's hugging me tight, chocolate cake smeared across both our faces, both of us laughing like we shared the best secret in the world. That night, I lay awake listening to the sounds of Chicago filtering through my thin walls, sirens and L trains and the couple upstairs arguing about money. I thought about my marriage to Robert, how we'd scraped and saved for 25 years so David could have opportunities we never dreamed of. How Robert worked double shifts at the factory while I took in sewing to pay for David's piano lessons, his Boy Scout trips, his college fund that grew dollar by dollar in a mason jar on our kitchen counter. We never had $50 chocolate. We never had Bitcoin or stock portfolios or investment accounts worth millions. What we had was love, the kind that showed up in chocolate cakes baked at dawn and hugs that lasted longer than necessary and bedtime stories read until the pages fell apart from overuse. But apparently, that wasn't enough anymore. Do you know that feeling when you realize you've been slowly disappearing from your own family story? When the person you raised, the child you sacrificed for, starts treating you like a supporting character in their life. I want you to think about that for a moment, because what I'm about to tell you gets much harder before it gets better. The sacrifices started small, the way most erosions do. When David graduated from Northwestern with his finance degree, Robert and I cashed in our retirement fund to help him with the security deposit on his first apartment. $23,000, money we'd saved for 15 years by eating hamburger instead of steak, by driving our old Buick until the transmission gave out, by wearing the same winter coats until they were more patches than original fabric. It's an investment in his future, Robert said, signing the withdrawal slip with hands stained permanently black from 30 years at the steel mill. Our boy's going to be somebody. David was somebody, all right. Within 2 years, he was making more money than Robert and I had ever seen, working for a downtown firm that managed investment portfolios worth millions for Chicago's wealthiest families. He bought a condo in Lincoln Park with a view of the lake, drove a BMW that cost more than our old house in Queens, wore suits that cost more than our monthly grocery budget. And he was happy. That was what mattered to us then, seeing David thrive in a world we'd never been able to give him. When he brought Sarah home for the first time, 3 years out of college and already talking about stock options and cryptocurrency like they were familiar friends, we welcomed her with the same warmth we'd given all of David's girlfriends over the years. Sarah was beautiful in that carefully constructed way that money makes possible: perfect teeth from expensive orthodontics, silky blonde hair that stayed in place no matter what, clothes that fit like they were designed specifically for her body. She was polite to us, pleasant even, though there was always something distant in her green eyes, like she was looking past us toward something more interesting. The wedding was everything we couldn't afford to give David ourselves. Sarah's father, a successful attorney who'd made his fortune in corporate law and smart investments, spared no expense. The reception was at the Palmer House, with centerpieces that cost more than our monthly rent and champagne that Sarah assured me was vintage. I wore my navy dress from Sears, the same one I'd worn to church for 5 years, and smiled until my cheeks ached while 200 strangers celebrated my son's marriage to a woman who called me Mrs. Thompson even after the rings were exchanged. When David and Sarah bought their house in Evanston 2 years later, a sprawling colonial with 4 bedrooms and a 3-car garage, I was genuinely happy for them. The house was everything Robert and I had dreamed of when we were young: hardwood floors that gleamed like mirrors, a kitchen bigger than our entire apartment, a backyard where grandchildren could play someday. "Mom, we need to talk," David said during one of our monthly dinners, back when monthly dinners still happened. We were at a restaurant in Evanston, nothing fancy but nice enough that I'd worn my good blouse and the pearl earrings Robert had given me on our 20th anniversary. "Sarah and I have been talking about investments, about securing our future." He paused, stirring sugar into his coffee with the precise movements that reminded me so much of his father. "The housing market is really hot right now, and we want to capitalize on that. We're thinking about buying a second property, maybe something we can rent out for additional income." I nodded, not understanding the financial complexities but proud that my son was smart enough to think ahead, to build wealth in ways Robert and I never could. "The thing is," David continued, not quite meeting my eyes, "we need a larger down payment than we originally planned. Sarah found this amazing place in Lake Forest, but it's going to require about $40,000 upfront. $40,000. More money than Robert and I had ever seen at one time in our entire lives. I thought about our savings account, the modest nest egg we'd rebuilt after helping David with his first apartment, money we'd set aside for emergencies or maybe a small vacation someday. "I know it's a lot to ask," David said quickly, "but it's really an investment for all of us. The rental income would be substantial, and property values in Lake Forest are only going to increase. You'd be getting your money back, plus interest, within 2 years. Sarah reached across the table and touched my hand, the first physical contact she'd initiated in the 3 years I'd known her. Her engagement ring caught the light, a diamond so large it seemed almost vulgar on her slender finger. "Mrs. Thompson, we wouldn't ask if we weren't absolutely certain about the return on investment. David's connections in the finance world have given us access to opportunities that most people never see. This could set us up for life, maybe even make us millionaires within the next decade." Millionaires? The word hung in the air like expensive perfume, intoxicating and slightly overwhelming. I thought about David as a little boy, counting the coins in our mason jar, asking if we were poor because Billy Henderson's dad had a new car and we were still driving the rusty Buick with the hole in the floor. "We're not poor, honey," I'd told him then. "We just measure our wealth differently." Now my son was talking about millions, about Bitcoin and stock investments and rental properties, about a world where $40,000 was just a stepping stone to something bigger. Part of me was proud that he'd climbed so far from our humble beginnings. Part of me was terrified that he'd climbed so high he couldn't see us anymore. "Of course," I said, because what else could I say when my son needed help? "Robert and I will figure something out." Robert wasn't happy about it. That night, he sat at our kitchen table with the bank statements spread out like a diagnosis, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, his mouth set in the grim line I recognized from the lean years when the factory cut overtime and we lived on beans and rice for weeks at a time. "Margaret, this is everything we've saved for the past 8 years. If something happens to one of us, if we get sick, if the roof needs fixing." He rubbed his forehead with both hands, a gesture that meant he was trying to solve a problem that had no good solution. "It's an investment, Robert." David explained it all. "We'll get our money back with interest." David explained a lot of things over the years that sounded good at the time. Robert's voice was gentle but tired. Remember when he needed $5,000 for that business opportunity right out of college? The one that was going to revolutionize online marketing? I did remember. The business opportunity that lasted 6 months before David moved on to his job at the investment firm, leaving us $5,000 poorer and David $5,000 wiser about the difference between dreams and reality. This is different, I said, though I wasn't sure why I believed it would be. Robert nodded slowly, the way he always did when he disagreed with me but loved me too much to argue. If you think it's the right thing to do, Margaret, then we'll do it. The next morning, we went to the bank together, Robert in his good suit and me in my church dress, like we were attending a funeral instead of making a withdrawal. The banker, a young woman about David's age with a sympathetic smile, walked us through the paperwork while I tried not to think about the 40 years it had taken us to save that money. David hugged me when I handed him the cashier's check, a real hug that lasted longer than his usual quick embraces and smelled like expensive cologne and gratitude. Sarah kissed my cheek and promised to send me pictures of the Lake Forest property once they closed on it. "You're amazing, Mom," David said. "This really is going to change everything for us." He was right about that. It did change everything, just not in the way I'd expected. The rental property in Lake Forest was beautiful, I'll give them that. Sarah sent me pictures as promised, a stunning Tudor-style home with leaded glass windows and a garden that looked like something from a magazine. The rental income, she explained, would be $2,500 a month, more than enough to pay us back within 2 years while still providing them with significant profit. But 2 years came and went without any mention of repayment. When I finally gathered the courage to bring it up during one of our increasingly rare phone calls, David sounded surprised, as if he'd forgotten about the loan entirely. "Oh, Mom, we've had some unexpected expenses with the rental property. The tenants caused some damage, and we had to completely renovate the kitchen. The property management company has been a nightmare to deal with." His voice carried that distracted tone I'd come to recognize, the sound of someone multitasking, probably checking emails or stock prices while talking to his mother. "Of course, I understand," I said, though I didn't really understand anything about rental properties or property management or the kinds of problems that required $40,000 to solve. "Maybe we could work out a payment plan, something small each month?" "Absolutely. Sarah is actually handling most of the financial details on that property now. She's really good with numbers, much better than I am. I'll have her call you this week and work something out." Sarah never called that week, or the week after, or the month after that. When I finally called her directly, she was polite but firm in a way that reminded me of my old boss at the department store where I worked before David was born. "Mrs. Thompson, I appreciate your patience with this situation. The reality is that the Lake Forest property has been much more challenging than we anticipated. We're actually operating at a loss right now, between the mortgage payments and the maintenance costs and the property management fees. David and I have had to invest an additional $60,000 of our own money just to keep it afloat." $60,000 of their own money. I thought about how easily she said that number, like it was pocket change instead of more than Robert and I had earned in 3 years combined. I thought about our empty savings account, about the roof leak we couldn't afford to fix, about Robert's arthritis medication that got more expensive every month. "I understand these things take time," I said carefully. "But Robert and I are on a fixed income." "Of course, and we really appreciate everything you've done for us. David always talks about how generous you and Mr. Thompson have been over the years. As soon as we get the property situation stabilized, you'll be our first priority for repayment." First priority for repayment. The phrase had a business-like quality that made me feel like a creditor instead of a mother, like someone seeking payment on a debt instead of someone who'd given everything they had to help their son succeed. That was 3 years ago. The Lake Forest property, according to David's occasional updates, continued to be problematic. There were tenant issues and market fluctuations and something about changes in property tax assessments that I didn't pretend to understand. What I did understand was that my son was now driving a Tesla, that Sarah wore a different designer handbag every time I saw her, and that their social media posts showed expensive dinners and weekend trips to places I'd only seen in magazines. Meanwhile, Robert and I learned to stretch Social Security further than we'd ever imagined possible. We ate a lot of pasta and canned soup, shopped at discount grocery stores, and kept the thermostat at 65 degrees all winter while our old radiator wheezed and clanked through the Chicago cold. Robert took a part-time job at Home Depot, standing on his feet 8 hours a day despite the arthritis in his knees, because we needed the employee discount on the plumbing parts to fix the leak under our kitchen sink. The irony wasn't lost on me that while David made millions in the stock market and earned bonuses from Bitcoin investments, his father was crawling under sinks at age 74 because we couldn't afford to call a plumber. But I told myself it was temporary, that success took time, that David would remember his obligations once things settled down. I told myself a lot of things during those years, creating stories that made the disappointment bearable, crafting explanations that preserved the image of the son I'd raised to be grateful and kind. The truth was harder to accept. Somewhere along the way, David had learned that money was more important than memory, that opportunity mattered more than obligation, that the people who helped you climb the ladder could be forgotten once you reached the top. When Robert died of a heart attack on a Tuesday morning in February, 3 days before Valentine's Day, David flew back from a business trip in New York to help with the funeral arrangements. He stood beside me at the graveside, handsome in his expensive black overcoat, his arm around my shoulders as we watched them lower Robert into the frozen ground. After the service, as we walked back to the funeral home parking lot, David squeezed my hand and said, "Mom, if you need anything at all, you just have to ask. Dad would want me to take care of you." I thought about that promise during the long nights that followed, when the apartment felt too big and too small at the same time, when I lay awake listening to the silence where Robert's breathing used to be. I thought about it when the medical bills started arriving, when I realized that Medicare didn't cover everything, that dying in America was almost as expensive as living. I thought about it when I called David 6 months later, my voice shaking with embarrassment and grief, to ask if he could help with the outstanding hospital bills. "Oh, Mom," he said, and I could hear the regret in his voice, genuine but distant. "The timing is just really tough right now. Sarah and I are in the middle of this major investment opportunity, something that could set us up for life. We've got every dollar tied up in Bitcoin and some stock options that are supposed to pay out huge returns. Every dollar tied up." I wondered if he'd forgotten about the $40,000 we'd never seen again, if that counted as one of the tied-up dollars or if it had simply disappeared into the mathematical complexity of his financial success. "Of course," I said, because what else could I say? "I understand." And I did understand, more than I wanted to. I understood that I was no longer David's first priority, that the woman who'd given him life had been replaced by the wife who shared his bed and the investments that filled his bank account. I understood that the son I'd raised had learned to measure love in dollars and cents, and by that measure, I was worth less than a stock option or a cryptocurrency fluctuation. People ask me sometimes how I let it happen, how I allowed my own son to use me and discard me like a worn-out appliance. The answer is simple: it happened so gradually that I didn't notice until it was too late. One small compromise led to another, one small sacrifice grew into a larger one, just this once, became a pattern that defined our relationship. By the time I realized what was happening, I'd become complicit in my own diminishment, trained to say yes when David needed something and to expect nothing in return. I'd become the kind of mother who apologized for asking for help, who felt grateful for the occasional phone call, who measured her worth by her son's willingness to acknowledge her existence. But that birthday cake, that message delivered through David's voice about Sarah's $50 chocolate, was the moment I finally saw myself clearly, a 73-year-old woman who'd spent so many years trying to earn her son's love that she'd forgotten her own value. Have you ever reached that moment in your own life? That instant when you realize you've been accepting crumbs while calling them a feast? Because what happened next changed everything, and I need you to understand how deep the pain had to go before I found the strength to climb out of it. The loneliness after Robert died was like learning a new language, one I never wanted to speak but had no choice but to master. The apartment that had been cozy with 2 people became a cavern of silence with just me rattling around in it, talking to my wilted plants and the framed photographs of David at various ages, all of them smiling back at me with the unconditional love I remembered but no longer recognized in the man he'd become. My 70th birthday came and went without acknowledgement. Not a card, not a call, not even a text message. I sat at my kitchen table that evening, looking at the cupcake I'd bought myself at the grocery store, a sad little thing with bright pink frosting that tasted like disappointment. I lit one candle, made a wish I knew wouldn't come true, and blew it out while the Chicago wind held outside my windows like grief-given voice. 3 days later, David called with apologies and explanations. Sarah had been dealing with a family crisis, he'd been traveling constantly for work, they'd been meaning to call but time had gotten away from them. The words felt rehearsed, like a script he'd practiced to handle inconvenient obligations. "We'll make it up to you, Mom. Maybe dinner next month when things calm down." Dinner next month became drinks in 2 months, which became coffee in 3 months, which became a phone call promising to get together soon when the weather got better. Soon stretched into months, months stretched into seasons, and seasons stretched into the understanding that I was no longer part of David's definition of family. The microaggressions were subtle but constant, designed to remind me of my place in the new hierarchy of David's life. Sarah would post pictures on social media of elaborate dinner parties at their house, carefully composed images of beautiful people eating expensive food, and I would scroll through them looking for any sign that I'd been considered for the guest list. I never found one. When I called David at work, his secretary would put me on hold for increasingly longer periods before transferring the call, always with the same apologetic explanation: he's in a meeting, but he wanted me to tell you he'll call you back. The return calls came less frequently as time passed, often days later when he was driving somewhere and had a few minutes to spare. Sorry, Mom, it's been crazy here. The markets have been volatile, and we're managing some major portfolios that require constant attention. His voice would compete with road noise and Bluetooth static, making our conversations feel even more distant than the miles between us. I learned not to call during market hours, not to expect callbacks on weekends, not to mention my own needs or problems because they seemed petty compared to the millions of dollars David managed for other families. Other families who apparently deserved more attention than the woman who'd raised him. The Christmas that broke my heart wasn't dramatic or cruel, just quietly devastating in the way that neglect often is. David and Sarah hosted a holiday party at their house, an elegant affair with catered food and hired bartenders and a guest list that included Sarah's family, David's colleagues, and several neighbors from their exclusive Evanston neighborhood. I learned about it from Sarah's Instagram posts the day after the party, carefully curated photos of champagne toasts and designer dresses and a dining room table that could have seated 20 people. In one photo, I could see the corner of the kitchen where I'd stood awkwardly during David's birthday celebration 2 years earlier, back when I was still occasionally included in family gatherings. I stared at that photo for a long time, trying to imagine where I might have fit among those beautiful, successful people with their perfect smiles and expensive clothes. The truth was, I wouldn't have fit at all. I would have been the elderly woman in the discount department store dress, making small talk about television shows while everyone else discussed stock portfolios and vacation homes in Aspen. But I would have liked to have been invited anyway. The hospital incident was the first crack in the facade I'd built to protect myself from the reality of my situation. I'd fallen in the bathroom on a Tuesday morning in December, slipping on the wet tile and hitting my head hard enough to see stars. The world tilted sideways for a moment, and I lay there on the cold floor wondering if this was how I'd be found, alone and forgotten in an apartment that nobody visited. I managed to get up and drive myself to the emergency room, though the process took most of the day and all of my courage. The ER was crowded with Chicago's winter casualties, slip-and-fall injuries, flu cases, heart attacks brought on by shoveling snow. I sat in the waiting room for 4 hours with a bag of frozen peas pressed to the growing knot on my head, watching other patients get called back while I remained invisible. When they finally took me for x-rays and a CT scan, the doctor, a young resident who looked barely old enough to drive, told me I had a mild concussion and needed someone to stay with me for 24 hours to monitor my condition. "Do you have family who can help?" she asked, her pen poised over my discharge papers. "My son," I said automatically, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself anymore. I called David from the hospital payphone, my hands shaking from the concussion or fear or both. The phone rang 6 times before going to voicemail, and I listened to his professional greeting asking me to leave a detailed message and promised response within 24 hours. 24 hours. The exact amount of time I needed someone to make sure I didn't die from a brain injury. "David, it's Mom. I'm at Northwestern Memorial. I had a fall and hit my head, and they won't release me unless someone can stay with me tonight. Could you please call me back as soon as possible?" I waited in the hospital lobby for 3 hours, calling David's number every 30 minutes and getting the same voicemail greeting each time. I called Sarah's number, but it went straight to voicemail too. I even tried calling David's office, but the receptionist told me he was in meetings all day and couldn't be disturbed for personal calls. Personal calls. As if his mother's head injury was a personal inconvenience rather than an emergency. Finally, I lied to the discharge nurse, telling her my son was on his way and would meet me at home. She looked skeptical but processed my paperwork anyway, probably because they needed the bed for someone whose family actually showed up when called. I took a taxi home and spent the night sitting up in my recliner, fighting the urge to sleep because I'd read somewhere that people with concussions shouldn't sleep alone. Every hour, I checked my phone for messages from David, and every hour I was disappointed by the silence. David called the next morning at 10:15, just as I was finally allowing myself to believe I wasn't going to die from my head injury. "Mom, I got your message. Sorry I missed your call yesterday, but I was in client meetings all day and couldn't get away. Are you okay?" His voice was rushed, distracted, like he was already thinking about the next item on his busy schedule. I could hear keyboard typing in the background and realized he was probably checking emails while talking to me. "I'm fine now," I said, though I wasn't sure that was true. My head still ached, and everything felt slightly surreal, like I was watching my life happen to someone else. "The doctor said I have a mild concussion, but it could have been worse." "Well, that's good. I mean, that it wasn't worse. You should probably be more careful, Mom. Maybe think about getting one of those life alert necklaces or something." A life alert necklace. The kind advertised during daytime television, designed for elderly people who'd outlived their usefulness to their families. The kind that meant you were officially old and alone and couldn't count on anyone to check on you even when you ended up in the hospital. That might be a good idea, I said, because arguing would have required energy I didn't have and might have prolonged a conversation he clearly wanted to end. Great. Listen, Mom, I'm really swamped this week, but let's definitely talk soon, okay? After he hung up, I sat in my recliner for another hour, holding the phone and trying to understand how the little boy who used to worry when I got paper cuts had become a man who couldn't be bothered to visit his mother in the hospital. I thought about the times I'd stayed up all night when he had childhood fevers, checking his temperature every hour, bringing him ice chips and cool washcloths, singing lullabies until my voice gave out. Parents don't expect gratitude for that kind of love. We give it freely, without conditions or expectations of return. But we don't expect to be forgotten either, to become so irrelevant that a head injury barely registers as noteworthy in our children's busy lives. That's when I began to suspect I was being used rather than loved, tolerated rather than cherished. The realization crept in slowly, like cold air through a cracked window, bringing with it a chill that had nothing to do with the Chicago winter. But the discovery that truly broke my heart came 3 months later, buried in a stack of papers I found while helping Sarah organize some financial documents for their accountant. She'd asked me to sort through old bank statements and investment reports, a task I'd foolishly interpreted as a sign that I was being included in their lives again, that my help was valued. I was sitting at their dining room table, the same table where I'd once felt so awkward during family celebrations, organizing papers by date and account type, when I found the email printout that changed everything. It was correspondence between Sarah and a real estate agent in Arizona, discussing the sale of a property in Scottsdale that I'd never heard of before. The property sold for $230,000, according to the final sales documents. But what caught my attention was the description: a rental property originally purchased as an investment in 2018, the same year David and Sarah bought the Lake Forest rental property with my $40,000. I kept reading, my hands trembling as the pieces fell into place. They hadn't bought one rental property with my money, they'd bought two. The Lake Forest property, which they'd told me was struggling and operating at a loss, had actually been sold 2 years ago for a substantial profit. That profit, combined with additional funds they'd borrowed from David's 401k and some Bitcoin investments that had paid off handsomely, had allowed them to purchase the Scottsdale property, which they'd now sold for enough money to pay off both their student loans and the mortgage on their primary residence. They were debt-free millionaires, and I was still waiting for my $40,000 back. I sat at that dining room table for 20 minutes, reading and rereading the documents, hoping I'd misunderstood something, that there was an explanation that didn't involve my son and daughter-in-law deliberately deceiving me about their financial situation while I struggled to pay for Robert's medical bills. But the numbers were clear, laid out in black and white with the kind of precision that David had learned in his finance career. They'd taken my life savings, used it to build wealth I couldn't even comprehend, and lied to me about their ability to pay me back while I ate canned soup and kept my thermostat at 60 degrees to save money on heating bills. When Sarah came home from her yoga class and found me still sitting at the table with the papers spread around me like evidence at a crime scene, her face went through a series of expressions: surprise, recognition, calculation, and finally, cold determination. "I see you found our real estate documents," she said, setting down her designer gym bag and smoothing her blonde hair with movements that seemed calculated to show off the diamond tennis bracelet David had given her for their anniversary. "I was just organizing for the accountant, like you asked," I said carefully, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. "I didn't mean to pry." "Of course not." Sarah sat across from me at the table, her green eyes steady and unblinking. "But since you've seen everything, I suppose we should talk." She spoke to me like I was a child who discovered something I wasn't supposed to know, her tone patient but condescending. She explained the complexities of real estate investment, the way money had to be moved around to maximize tax advantages and capitalize on market opportunities. She used words like liquidity and portfolio diversification and capital gains optimization, financial terminology designed to make me feel stupid and out of my depth. "The important thing is that David and I have been very successful with our investments," she said, her manicured fingers drumming against the polished wood table. "We've built significant wealth, which benefits everyone in the family long term." Everyone in the family. I wondered if that included the family member whose life savings had made their success possible, who was currently living on Social Security and store-brand groceries while they planned their next vacation to Europe. "What about my $40,000? I asked quietly. Sarah's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes, like a curtain being drawn. "Mrs. Thompson, I understand that from your perspective, that money feels important. But you have to understand that David and I are managing assets worth over $2 million now. Your $40,000 is certainly part of our overall financial picture, but it's not something we can just liquidate without affecting our entire investment strategy." $2 million. She said it casually, like mentioning the weather, while explaining why $40,000 was too complicated to return to the woman who'd given it to them in the first place. Of course, I said, because I'd been trained over the years to say, of course, when David and Sarah explained why they couldn't do something I needed. I understand. But I didn't understand. I understood that my son had become someone I no longer recognized, someone who could accumulate millions while leaving his mother to struggle with medical bills from his father's funeral. I understood that the values Robert and I had tried to teach him about gratitude and responsibility had been replaced by the values of a world where money mattered more than the people who helped you earn it. That night, I went home to my small apartment and sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, thinking about the $40,000 that had represented everything Robert and I had managed to save in our entire working lives. $40,000 that barely registered as significant in David and Sarah's new world of cryptocurrency and stock options and real estate investments worth millions. I thought about Robert, about how hard he'd worked for that money, about the double shifts and the aching knees and the years of wearing the same winter coat so we could put a few more dollars in the mason jar that eventually became our savings account. I thought about the dreams we'd had for that money, maybe a small trip someday, maybe some home repairs, maybe just the peace of mind that came from knowing we had something set aside for emergencies. Instead, we'd given it all to David, trusting that our son would remember where he came from, that success wouldn't make him forget the people who'd sacrificed for his opportunities. That trust felt like the most expensive mistake we'd ever made. I picked up my favorite teacup, the one with tiny blue flowers that had belonged to my mother, and somehow it slipped from my trembling fingers. The sound of porcelain shattering against the linoleum floor was sharp and final, like something breaking inside my chest that could never be repaired. As I knelt on my kitchen floor, collecting pieces of my mother's teacup and crying for the first time since Robert's funeral, one word whispered through my mind with increasing persistence: no. No, I would not continue to accept this treatment. No, I would not keep pretending that my son's financial success justified his emotional abandonment. No, I would not spend whatever years I had left apologizing for expecting basic decency from the child I'd raised to be kind. For the first time in 3 years, since the day I'd handed David that cashier's check for $40,000, I allowed myself to imagine what would happen if I stopped saying yes to everything he asked and started saying no to things I didn't want to give. The possibility was terrifying and liberating in equal measure, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing you might actually be brave enough to jump. But I wasn't ready to jump yet. I spent the next several weeks thinking about that broken teacup and what it might mean to stop being so breakable myself, to stop letting other people's carelessness shatter what I valued most. The courage to change didn't come all at once. It built slowly, through small recognitions and growing anger and the gradual understanding that I deserved better than what I'd been accepting. What finally pushed me over the edge was David's response when I asked for a small loan to fix my furnace, which had given out during the coldest week of February while temperatures dropped below zero and the wind off Lake Michigan felt like glass cutting through my bones. "Mom, I wish I could help, but we've got all our assets tied up right now. Sarah and I are looking at this amazing opportunity to invest in some startup company that develops blockchain technology for cryptocurrency trading. It's the kind of thing that could triple our investment in 2 years. Blockchain technology for cryptocurrency trading." While his mother sat in an apartment so cold she could see her breath, David was planning to triple investments worth millions of dollars but couldn't spare a few thousand to keep his mother from freezing to death. That's when I finally found my voice, rusty from years of disuse but still strong enough to carry one small word: no. It was time to stop being grateful for crumbs and start demanding the respect I should have been given all along. But first, I had to learn how to fight for myself, and after 7 decades of putting everyone else's needs first, that was going to be the hardest lesson I'd ever learned. I need you to understand that saying no to your own child, even when that child has become an adult who treats you poorly, goes against every instinct you develop as a parent. We're wired to say yes, to give, to sacrifice, to put our children's needs ahead of our own comfort or security or dignity. Breaking that pattern felt like trying to write with my opposite hand, clumsy and unnatural and somehow wrong. But I was tired of being wrong about my own worth. The confrontation happened on a Thursday evening in March, during one of our rare phone calls. David had called to tell me about their latest vacation to Napa Valley, describing wine tastings at vineyards I'd never heard of and dinners at restaurants where a single meal cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. "You should see this place, Mom. Sarah found it through some connections she has in the wine industry. It's exclusive, like you have to know somebody to even get a reservation. The view from our suite is incredible, just rolling hills covered with grapevines as far as you can see." I listened to him describe luxury I couldn't imagine while sitting in my cold apartment, wearing Robert's old cardigan over 2 sweaters and thick socks to keep warm while waiting for a repairman I couldn't afford to fix the furnace that shouldn't have needed fixing in the first place if I hadn't given away my emergency fund to help my son get richer. That sounds wonderful, I said automatically, the phrase I'd perfected over the years to show enthusiasm for a life I'd never be invited to experience. It really is incredible. Sarah's already planning our next trip there for harvest season. Apparently, that's when they have these amazing parties where you can actually participate in the winemaking process. It's like $2,000 per person, but the experience is supposed to be once in a lifetime. $2,000 per person. $4,000 for both of them. $4,000 to play at making wine while I tried to figure out how to pay for furnace repairs on a Social Security budget that barely covered my basic living expenses. David, I said, and something in my voice must have been different because he stopped talking about wine parties and waited. I need to ask you for a favor. Of course, Mom. What can I do for you? For a moment, I heard an echo of the boy who used to jump up from whatever he was doing when I called his name, eager to help with anything I needed. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man who'd learned to measure assistance in terms of convenience and cost-benefit analysis. My furnace broke down 2 weeks ago, and I've been living without heat ever since. The repair estimate is $3,500 for a new unit, or $1,200 to fix the old one, but it's so old that fixing it might just be throwing money away. I took a deep breath, tasting the humiliation of having to ask my millionaire son for help paying bills that wouldn't even register as significant expenses in his world. I was hoping maybe you could help me with the cost. Silence stretched across the phone line like a chasm I'd never noticed before. Finally, David cleared his throat with the sound men make when they're about to deliver disappointing news gently. Mom, I really wish I could help with that, but Sarah and I are completely tied up financially right now. We've made some major investments that have all our liquid assets locked up for the next 6 to 8 months. There's this blockchain technology opportunity one mentioned, plus we're looking at expanding our real estate portfolio with some commercial properties downtown that require significant capital commitments. Capital commitments. Liquid assets. Blockchain technology. The language of a world where millions of dollars in investments took priority over preventing your mother from freezing to death in a Chicago winter. We're talking about really life-changing amounts of money here, Mom. The kind of wealth that could set us up permanently, maybe even allow me to retire early and focus on other interests. I know the timing is terrible with your furnace situation, but sometimes you have to make short-term sacrifices for long-term gains. Short-term sacrifices. He was talking about my warmth, my comfort, my ability to live safely in my own home, as if these were minor inconveniences rather than basic human needs. What about the money you borrowed from me? The words came out before I could stop them, carrying years of accumulated hurt and disappointment. The $40,000 Robert and I loaned you for the rental property investment? Another pause, longer this time. When David spoke again, his voice had changed, taking on the patient tone people use when explaining something obvious to someone slow to understand. Mom, that money was invested in our overall financial strategy years ago. It's not like we have it sitting in a checking account somewhere. Everything is tied up in assets that we can't liquidate without taking massive losses in capital gains taxes and early withdrawal penalties. Everything is tied up in assets. I thought about Sarah's diamond tennis bracelet, about their BMW and Tesla, about the designer handbags I'd seen in her social media posts, about the Napa Valley vacation they'd just returned from and the harvest season trip they were already planning. But we could work out some kind of payment plan, David continued, his voice warming slightly as he found a solution that didn't require immediate action on his part. Maybe you could get the furnace fixed on credit, and then we could help you with the monthly payments once our investments become more liquid. That way you get the heat you need, and we don't have to disrupt our financial planning. Get it on credit. At my age, with my income, so that my son could avoid disrupting financial plans that included $4,000 winemaking vacations and blockchain investments worth millions of dollars. That's when something shifted inside me, like a gear clicking into place after years of grinding uselessly. That's when I finally understood that I wasn't David's mother anymore. I was a creditor he'd learned to manage with promises and explanations and payment plans that would never materialize. No, I said quietly. No what, Mom? No, I won't get it on credit so you can maintain your investment portfolio. No, I won't accept your explanation about tied-up assets while you plan $4,000 vacations. No, I won't pretend anymore that what you're doing is acceptable. The silence that followed was different from his earlier pauses. This silence had weight, the kind that settles between people when something fundamental has shifted in their relationship. Mom, I think maybe you're not understanding the complexity of our financial situation. I understand perfectly, I said, and my voice was steadier than it had been in years. I understand that you have $2 million in assets and can't spare $3,500 to keep your mother from freezing. I understand that you can afford harvest season wine parties but not furnace repairs for the woman who gave you her life savings. I understand that you're not the man I raised you to be. That's not fair, Mom. You know how grateful Sarah and I are for everything you and Dad did for us over the years. But we have our own financial responsibilities now, our own obligations. What about your obligation to me? The question hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire that had been smoldering for years and finally burst into flames. I could hear David breathing on the other end of the line, could imagine him sitting in his beautiful house with its perfect heating system, trying to find the right words to make me reasonable again, compliant again, grateful for whatever scraps of attention he was willing to throw my way. Mom, you're being emotional about this. I know it's frustrating when money is tight, but you have to understand that Sarah and I have worked really hard to build the life we have. We can't jeopardize our financial security every time someone in the family has an unexpected expense. Someone in the family. As if I was a distant relative making unreasonable demands instead of the woman who'd given him life and raised him and sacrificed her own dreams so he could build the wealth he was now protecting from me. Goodbye, David. I hung up before he could respond, before he could find more words to explain why my need for heat was less important than his need for investment opportunities, why my comfort mattered less than his capital gains. For the first time in 3 years, I'd ended a conversation with my son instead of waiting for him to find a reason to rush off the phone. For the first time in decades, I'd stopped accepting unacceptable behavior just because it came from someone I loved. It felt terrifying and liberating and absolutely necessary, like major surgery that hurts but saves your life. The next morning, I called Mr. Albright, my downstairs neighbor who'd been trying to help me with various apartment issues since Robert died. He was 78 years old, a retired teacher who'd lost his wife to cancer 2 years ago, and he had the kind of practical knowledge about furnaces and plumbing and electrical work that came from 60 years of home ownership and a generation that fixed things instead of replacing them. Margaret, I've been wondering how you've been managing with that old furnace, he said when I explained the situation. I heard it struggling all winter, and I kept meaning to ask if you needed any help with it. Help. The offer came without conditions or explanations about tied-up assets or investment portfolios. Just help, freely given, because neighbors look out for each other and because some people still believe that caring for others is more important than protecting your own convenience. I can't afford to pay much, I told him honestly. My son, well, he's not able to help right now. Mr. Albright was quiet for a moment, and I wondered if he was thinking the same thing I was, that a son who drove a Tesla and lived in $1 million house should be able to help his mother with a furnace repair. But he was too polite to say it, just as I'd been too ashamed to acknowledge it. Money's not the issue, Margaret. I've got more than I need, and fixing furnaces is something I actually enjoy. Keeps my hands busy, gives me a project to work on. Would you mind if I took a look at your unit this afternoon? That evening, for the first time in 2 weeks, my apartment was warm. Mr. Albright had spent 4 hours working on my ancient furnace, replacing parts and cleaning components and performing the kind of patient, careful maintenance that extended its life by several years. When I tried to pay him for the parts, he waved away my money with hands stained from honest work. My pleasure, Margaret. That old girl should run fine now, but you let me know if she starts acting up again. His kindness made me cry, not just from gratitude but from the recognition of how long it had been since someone had helped me without expecting something in return, without making me feel guilty for needing assistance, without explaining why their own needs had to come first. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in weeks, warm and comfortable in my own home because a neighbor had cared enough to help without being asked. I dreamed about Robert, about the early years of our marriage when we looked out for each other with the same uncomplicated generosity that Mr. Albright had shown me. When I woke up, I realized something had changed in my understanding of what I deserved from the people in my life. I deserved to be warm. I deserved to be helped when I needed it. I deserved to be treated with the same consideration I'd given to others throughout my life. And I deserved better than what I'd been getting from my son. The next few weeks passed quietly, with no calls from David and none from me either. The silence felt different than the old silences between us, which had been filled with my worry about whether I'd done something wrong, whether I should apologize for expecting too much, whether I needed to be more understanding of his busy schedule and financial pressures. This silence was cleaner, like the quiet that comes after a storm passes and the air clears. I wasn't wondering what I'd done wrong because I knew I hadn't done anything wrong. I wasn't planning how to fix our relationship because I finally understood that I wasn't the one who'd broken it. But I also wasn't finished standing up for myself. If anything, I was just getting started. The thing about finally finding your voice after years of silence is that once you start using it, it gets stronger every time. Each no becomes easier, each boundary becomes clearer, each refusal to accept unacceptable behavior becomes more natural. The next test came sooner than I expected. Sarah called on a Tuesday afternoon in April, her voice bright with the false cheer she used when she wanted something. I almost didn't answer the phone, but curiosity won out over caution. I wondered what could possibly motivate Sarah to call me directly instead of routing requests through David. Mrs. Thompson, I hope you're doing well. I know things were a little tense the last time we talked, and I wanted to clear the air between us. Clear the air. As if our conflict was a misunderstanding rather than a fundamental disagreement about how family members should treat each other. I'm doing fine, Sarah. Thank you for asking. I'm so glad to hear that. Listen, the reason I'm calling is that David and I are in a bit of a bind, and we were hoping you might be able to help us out. A bit of a bind. I wondered what kind of bind could affect people with $2 million in assets. What kind of problem couldn't be solved by liquidating one of their many investments? David's company is going through some restructuring, and they've asked him to take a temporary pay cut while they reorganize their compensation structure. It's nothing serious, just corporate belt-tightening, but it means our monthly cash flow is going to be tight for the next few months. Cash flow? The euphemism felt carefully chosen, designed to make their problem sound technical rather than personal, like a mathematical issue rather than a consequence of their spending choices. I'm sorry to hear David's having trouble at work, I said carefully. Oh, it's not trouble exactly. It's actually a good thing long-term because they're promoting him to a more senior position once the restructuring is complete. But in the short term, we need to be more careful about our monthly expenses. More careful about monthly expenses. I thought about their mortgage payment, their car payments, their credit card bills from wine country vacations and designer shopping trips. I thought about the distance between more careful and living on Social Security while wearing your dead husband's sweater for warmth. The thing is, Sarah continued, we have this amazing opportunity to invest in a cryptocurrency startup that David's colleague is involved in. It's the kind of ground floor opportunity that could make us incredibly wealthy, but we need to contribute $50,000 by the end of the month to secure our position. $50,000. More than my total annual income. More than Robert had earned in his best year at the factory. More than David had borrowed from us for the rental property that had made them rich while leaving us broke. The problem is that most of our assets are tied up in long-term investments that we can't liquidate without penalty. So we were wondering. Sarah paused, letting the request build suspense like a TV commercial. We were wondering if you might consider letting us borrow against the equity in your apartment. It would just be temporary, until David's salary situation stabilizes, and we'd pay all the fees and interest of course. Borrow against the equity in my apartment. Use my home as collateral for their cryptocurrency gamble, risk losing the only security I had left so they could potentially become even wealthier. I don't have equity in my apartment, Sarah. I rent. Oh. A pause while she recalculated her approach. Well, what about your savings? Or maybe something we could work out with David's inheritance from your husband's life insurance. Robert's life insurance. The small policy that had barely covered his funeral expenses and medical bills, that had already been spent on the costs of dying in America. She wanted me to borrow against money that no longer existed to fund investment opportunities one couldn't understand for people who already had more wealth than they knew what to do with. There is no inheritance, Sarah. Robert's life insurance went to pay his hospital bills. Right, of course. I'm sorry, I didn't realize. Another pause, followed by a new strategy. What about a personal loan? Your credit is probably excellent after all these years, and interest rates are still pretty reasonable. We could co-sign if necessary, help you qualify for a larger amount. A personal loan. At 73 years old, on a fixed income, so that my son and his wife could invest in cryptocurrency startups while I took on debt I'd never be able to repay. Sarah, I said, and my voice carried the same steady tone I'd used with David during our last conversation. I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say. Of course, Mrs. Thompson. I am not going to take out loans so you can invest in cryptocurrency. I am not going to risk my home so you can get richer. I am not going to impoverish myself further to solve temporary cash flow problems created by your expensive lifestyle choices. Silence stretched across the phone line, filled with the sound of Sarah recalibrating her understanding of who she was dealing with. Mrs. Thompson, I think maybe you don't fully understand the opportunity we're trying to pursue here. This isn't some get-rich-quick scheme. David has thoroughly researched this investment, and the potential returns are extraordinary. We're talking about the kind of wealth that could benefit the whole family for generations. The whole family. I wondered if that included the family member who was being asked to risk her financial security for their benefit, who was expected to take on debt so they could avoid liquidating their own assets. I understand perfectly, I said. I understand that you want me to take financial risks so you don't have to. I understand that you consider my security less important than your opportunities. I understand that you think I'm stupid enough to believe that borrowing money I can't repay is somehow for my own good. That's not. I mean, we would never expect you to take risks you're not comfortable with. We just thought, since we're family, maybe we could work together on this opportunity. Work together. As if taking out loans while they reap the profits constituted partnership rather than exploitation. No, Sarah. I'm sorry. No. I will not take out loans for your investments. No, I will not risk my financial security for your opportunities. No, I will not pretend anymore that what you're asking is reasonable or fair or acceptable. The conversation ended much the way my last call with David had ended, with uncomfortable silence followed by hasty goodbyes and promises to talk again soon that neither of us believed. But this time, I wasn't shaking when I hung up the phone. This time, I felt calm and clear and proud of myself for refusing to be manipulated by people who should have been protecting me instead of using me. That evening, I sat in my warm apartment and realized that saying no was becoming easier each time I practiced it. Like any skill, it improved with use. Like any muscle, it grew stronger with exercise. I was finally learning to fight for myself, and it felt like discovering a talent I'd never known I possessed. But David and Sarah weren't finished trying to break down my newfound boundaries. The next assault on my independence came disguised as concern for my well-being, wrapped in the language of family love and delivered through the most effective weapon they had, my own grandchildren. Have you ever noticed how some people use the ones you love most as leverage against you? How they deploy affection like a weapon, making you choose between protecting yourself and maintaining relationships that matter to you. Because that's exactly what happened next, and it almost worked. The call came from Emma, my 12-year-old granddaughter, on a Saturday morning in May when the spring sunshine had finally started to warm Chicago enough for me to open my windows and let fresh air chase away the staleness of winter isolation. "Grandma Margaret?" Her voice was small and uncertain, nothing like the confident chatter I remembered from happier times when she used to spend weekends with Robert and me, when we'd make pancakes in the shape of animals and she'd help me tend the small garden behind our old house. "Emma, sweetheart, what a wonderful surprise. How are you, honey?" "I'm okay, I guess." A pause filled with the kind of hesitation that meant adult problems were intruding on childhood innocence. "Grandma, are you mad at Daddy?" The question hit me like cold water, not because I didn't expect it but because I'd hoped to avoid putting Emma in the middle of adult conflicts. Children shouldn't have to navigate their parents' failures or their grandparents' disappointment, shouldn't have to worry about family relationships fracturing around them. "Why would you ask that, sweetheart?" "Because Daddy said you're being mean to him and Mommy, and now you won't help us anymore when we need things. He said you're acting different, like you don't care about our family." I closed my eyes and leaned against my kitchen counter, feeling the weight of David and Sarah's manipulation bearing down on me through my granddaughter's innocent voice. They'd taken my refusal to enable their greed and reframed it as abandonment of family, turned my reasonable boundaries into evidence of cruelty or selfishness. "Emma, I love you and your brother very much. I love your daddy too, even when we disagree about things. But sometimes adults have to make difficult decisions about what's right and what's wrong. But Daddy says we might have to move out of our house because you won't help with money anymore. He says you have money saved up but you're too selfish to share it with your own family." Money saved up. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it, the idea that I was hoarding wealth while my poor son struggled to make ends meet in his $1 million house with his $2 million investment portfolio. But Emma's distress was real, manufactured by her parents but genuinely felt by a child who couldn't understand the complexities of adult financial manipulation. "Honey, I promise you that your family is not going to lose your house. Your daddy and mommy have plenty of money to pay for your home and everything you need. But Daddy says his job is in trouble and the stock market is bad and all their money is stuck in places where they can't get it out. He says if you really loved us, you'd help us like you used to help him when he was little." The comparison stung because it contained just enough truth to be effective. I had helped David when he was little, given him everything I could afford and some things I couldn't, sacrificed my own needs for his opportunities. But there was a difference between helping a child who needed support and enabling grown adults who'd learned to treat family generosity as an unlimited resource. "Emma, I need you to understand something important. Your daddy is a successful businessman who earns more money in 1 month than I see in a whole year. He and your mommy own expensive cars and a beautiful house and investments worth millions of dollars. They are not poor, and they are not in danger of losing their home. Then why do they keep fighting about money? Why does mommy cry when she talks about the bills? Sarah crying about bills while wearing $1,000 handbags and planning European vacations. The performance was masterful, designed to create the kind of emotional urgency that made unreasonable requests seem desperate rather than greedy. Sometimes people worry about money even when they have plenty of it, sweetheart. And sometimes they want things they can't afford right now, even though they have everything they need. I could hear voices in the background, adult whispers that sounded like coaching, like someone feeding Emma her lines for this conversation. My stomach twisted with the recognition that my own granddaughter was being used as a weapon against me, transformed from an innocent child into a messenger of guilt and manipulation. "Grandma, Daddy wants to talk to you." Before I could respond, David's voice came through the phone, tight with the controlled anger of someone who'd been counting on emotional blackmail to work and was frustrated by my resistance. "Mom, I can't believe you'd lie to Emma about our financial situation. She's 12 years old, she doesn't need to hear your version of our private business. My version? As if the facts I'd shared were opinions rather than objective reality, as if my refusal to pretend David was poor was somehow unfair to him. I told Emma the truth, David. That you're successful and wealthy and not in danger of losing your home. You're being incredibly selfish, Mom. Emma and Jake are scared because they can hear us arguing about money, and instead of helping your own family, you're telling them lies to make yourself feel better about being cheap. Cheap. The word hung between us like a slap, carrying decades of accumulated resentment about the modest lifestyle Robert and I had lived by necessity, the careful budgeting that had allowed us to help David despite our limited resources. Cheap, as if frugality born of poverty was a character flaw rather than a survival skill. David, I want you to listen very carefully. I am not cheap. I am poor. There's a difference, and the difference is that I don't choose to spend money on expensive vacations and luxury items while asking other people to subsidize my lifestyle. That's not, you're twisting everything, Mom. Sarah and I work hard for what we have. We deserve to enjoy the success we've built. You deserve to enjoy success you've built with your own money, not success funded by borrowing from other people and never paying them back. We never borrowed money from you, Mom. We received a family contribution toward an investment that has benefited all of us. A family contribution. 3 years after the fact, my life savings had been redefined as a gift rather than a loan, my $40,000 reclassified as voluntary support rather than money that was supposed to be returned. If it was a family contribution, David, then why did you promise to pay me back with interest? Why did Sarah explain that I'd be getting my money returned within 2 years? Silence stretched across the phone line while David searched for an explanation that didn't acknowledge what we both knew, that they'd lied to me from the beginning, that they'd never intended to repay money they'd taken under false pretenses. Look, Mom, we can argue about semantics all day, but the reality is that Emma and Jake are upset because their grandmother won't help their family anymore. Is that really the legacy you want? Is that how you want your grandchildren to remember you? My legacy. After 73 years of living, after raising a son and loving a husband and working and sacrificing and giving everything I had to the people I cared about, my legacy was being reduced to whether I'd enable my son's greed in his children's presence. I want my grandchildren to remember that their grandmother had dignity, I said quietly. I want them to remember that I taught them the difference between needs and wants, between helping and enabling, between love and manipulation. You're being ridiculous, Mom. We're not asking you for anything unreasonable. You're asking me to take out loans I can't afford to repay so you can invest in cryptocurrency while you own $2 million worth of assets. If that's not unreasonable to you, then we have very different definitions of the word. The conversation deteriorated from there, with David's voice getting louder and my resolve getting stronger, until finally he hung up on me with a promise that I'd regret choosing money over family, that Emma and Jake would grow up knowing their grandmother had abandoned them when they needed her most. After the call ended, I sat in my kitchen and cried for the little girl who'd been manipulated into calling me, for the relationship with my grandchildren that was being poisoned by their parents' greed, for the son I'd raised who'd learned to use children as weapons in conflicts they couldn't understand. But I didn't change my mind. If anything, the conversation had clarified something important. David and Sarah were willing to damage their own children's emotional well-being to get what they wanted from me. They were willing to create fear and insecurity in Emma and Jake rather than adjust their own spending or liquidate their own investments. People who would do that to their own children would eventually do worse to the grandmother who'd enabled their behavior. That realization wasn't comforting, but it was clarifying. It helped me understand that protecting myself wasn't just about dignity anymore, it was about survival. Because people who see family members as resources to be exploited don't stop exploiting until they've taken everything you have to give. 3 days later, Sarah called back with a different strategy, her voice warm with manufactured affection and false apology. Mrs. Thompson, I've been thinking about our conversation, and I realize I may have come across as insensitive to your situation. That wasn't my intention at all. Her intention. As if the problem had been poor communication rather than outrageous demands. I appreciate that, Sarah. The thing is, I talked to David about everything you've been going through since Mr. Thompson passed away, and we realized we haven't been as supportive as we should have been. We want to do better. Do better. The promise every manipulative person makes when their current approach stops working, the pledge to change that lasts exactly as long as it takes to get what they want. We were thinking maybe we could work out a different arrangement, something that would be mutually beneficial. Instead of you taking out loans for our investment opportunity, maybe we could bring you in as a partner. A partner. In cryptocurrency investments I didn't understand, managed by people who'd already stolen $40,000 from me and lied about their ability to pay it back. What kind of partnership? Well, you'd contribute whatever you're comfortable with, maybe $10,000 or $15,000 to start, and we'd handle all the technical aspects of the investment. You'd get a percentage of the profits based on your contribution level, just like any other investor. $10,000 or $15,000. Half of my annual income, invested in digital currencies that I couldn't see or touch or understand, managed by people whose primary expertise seemed to be separating family members from their money. And if the investment loses money? A pause, followed by the kind of laugh people use when they want to dismiss concerns without addressing them directly. Mrs. Thompson, David has been studying this market for months. The cryptocurrency sector is experiencing unprecedented growth, and this particular startup has connections to some of the biggest players in the industry. The risk of losing money is practically non-existent. Practically non-existent. Like the risk of never seeing my $40,000 again had been practically non-existent 3 years ago when they'd promised to pay me back with interest. I appreciate the offer, Sarah, but I'm not interested in cryptocurrency investments. But think about how this could benefit your grandchildren's future. Emma and Jake could have college funds that grow beyond anything traditional savings accounts could provide. This isn't just about us, it's about building wealth for the next generation. The next generation. Every con artist's favorite selling point, the promise that risky decisions would somehow benefit people too young to consent to the risks being taken on their behalf. No, Sarah. Mrs. Thompson, I don't think you're fully understanding the opportunity here. David has access to investment options that most people never even hear about. This is insider information, the kind of advantage that wealthy families use to stay wealthy. Insider information. Now she was implying that David's investment advice bordered on illegal, that I was being offered access to secrets that justified the risk of losing money I couldn't afford to lose. No. But, no, Sarah. I'm not interested in your investment opportunities. I'm not going to give you $10,000 or $15,000 or any amount of dollars to gamble with cryptocurrency or any other investments. I'm not going to partner with you, or loan to you, or contribute to your financial plans in any way. The silence that followed was different from the previous pauses in our conversation. This silence had the weight of final understanding, the recognition that I wasn't going to be moved by promises or opportunities or appeals to my grandchildren's future. I see, Sarah said finally, her voice cooling to the temperature I remembered from our first meeting 6 years ago. I hope you realize what you're giving up, Mrs. Thompson. Opportunities like this don't come along very often, especially for people in your financial situation. People in my financial situation. Poor people who should be grateful for any chance to improve their circumstances, even chances that required risking the little security they had left. I understand exactly what I'm giving up, Sarah. I'm giving up the chance to be exploited again. The conversation ended with polite goodbyes that fooled neither of us, with promises to talk soon that we both understood would never be kept. That evening, I made myself a cup of tea and sat by my window watching the sunset paint the Chicago sky in shades of orange and pink. For the first time in years, I felt something I'd almost forgotten: pride in my own judgment, confidence in my own decisions, respect for my own dignity. I'd said no to people I loved, and it hadn't killed me. If anything, it had made me stronger. But I wasn't naive enough to think the battle was over. I knew David and Sarah well enough by now to understand that they wouldn't give up easily, that they'd keep looking for new ways to access the resources they felt entitled to take from me. I just didn't realize their next attack would come from a direction I never saw coming, disguised as concern for my well-being and delivered by professionals who claimed to have my best interests at heart. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in June, from a woman who introduced herself as Karen Mitchell from Adult Protective Services. Her voice was crisp and official, carrying the kind of authority that makes you pay attention even when you don't want to. Mrs. Thompson, I'm calling because we've received a report of concern about your living situation. Would it be possible for me to schedule a home visit this week to discuss some issues that have been brought to our attention? A report of concern. I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair, my mind racing through possibilities. Who would contact Adult Protective Services about me? What kind of report would prompt an official investigation? What kind of issues? I asked carefully. I'd prefer to discuss the details in person, Mrs. Thompson. Would Thursday afternoon work for your schedule? Her tone was pleasant but firm, the voice of someone accustomed to cooperation rather than resistance. I agreed to the Thursday appointment because I didn't feel like I had a choice, but I spent the next 2 days cleaning my apartment and trying to imagine what could have triggered an investigation. Karen Mitchell arrived exactly on time, a professional woman in her 40s carrying a clipboard and wearing the kind of sensible shoes that suggested she spent a lot of time walking through other people's homes, evaluating other people's lives, making decisions about other people's competence. She was polite but thorough, examining my refrigerator and bathroom and bedroom with the practiced eye of someone searching for evidence of neglect or decline. She asked about my daily routine, my medical care, my social connections, my financial management, all with the careful tone of someone building a case. Mrs. Thompson, I need to ask about some specific concerns that were raised in the report we received. The caller indicated that you've been experiencing cognitive decline, possibly early-stage dementia, and that you've been making poor financial decisions that put you at risk. Cognitive decline. The phrase hit me like ice water, not because I believed it but because I suddenly understood what was happening. Someone had reported me as mentally incompetent, possibly dangerous to myself, in need of intervention by people with the authority to override my autonomy. Who made this report? I asked. I'm not able to share that information, but the caller expressed genuine concern about your well-being. They indicated that you've been confused about money, making unreasonable demands on family members, and possibly being influenced by people who don't have your best interests at heart. Unreasonable demands on family members. The irony was breathtaking. I'd been reported for financial incompetence by people who'd spent years pressuring me to make increasingly dangerous financial decisions on their behalf. The caller also mentioned that you've been isolating yourself from family, refusing help when it's offered, and showing signs of paranoia about people who are trying to assist you. Paranoia about people trying to assist me. My refusal to take out loans for David and Sarah's cryptocurrency investments had been reframed as evidence of mental illness, my boundaries redefined as symptoms of cognitive decline. Mrs. Mitchell, I can assure you that I'm mentally competent. I manage my own finances, maintain my own home, and make my own decisions about what kinds of help I'm willing to accept from family members. Of course, Mrs. Thompson. But I'm sure you understand that we have to take reports like this seriously, especially when they come from family members who are concerned about a loved one's safety. Family members. Now I knew who'd made the call, who'd decided that my refusal to enable their greed was evidence of mental incompetence that required intervention by the state. Karen Mitchell spent another hour in my apartment, documenting my answers to her questions, photographing my living space, reviewing my medication list and banking statements with the thoroughness of someone building a file that would determine my future autonomy. Everything appears to be in order here, Mrs. Thompson. Your home is clean and well maintained, your finances seem to be managed appropriately, and you're clearly capable of caring for yourself independently. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by anger at the stress I'd been put through, at the violation of having stranger examine my private life because my son had decided that my refusal to fund his investments constituted a mental health emergency. However, Karen continued, I do want to give you some information about resources available to seniors in your situation. There are financial counseling services, social programs, support groups for people dealing with family conflicts. She left me a folder full of brochures and pamphlets, contact information for services designed to help elderly people navigate the challenges of aging, the isolation, the vulnerability to exploitation by people they trusted. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was being given resources to protect myself from exactly the kind of exploitation I'd been experiencing from my own family. After Karen Mitchell left, I sat at my kitchen table and tried to process what had just happened. David and Sarah had reported me to Adult Protective Services, claimed I was mentally incompetent because I'd refused to give them money, attempted to use the power of the state to override my autonomy and force me back into compliance with their financial demands. It was the cruelest thing they'd done yet, not just because it was false but because it was designed to destroy my credibility with everyone who might try to help me in the future. If I complained about their treatment of me, people could dismiss my concerns as the confused ramblings of an elderly woman with documented cognitive problems. That night, I lay awake thinking about the calculated cruelty of what they'd done, the way they'd weaponized my age and vulnerability against me, turned my own need for independence into evidence of incompetence. But I also thought about Karen Mitchell's conclusion, her official determination that I was competent and capable and managing my life appropriately despite my family's claims to the contrary. A professional with years of experience evaluating elderly people had looked at my situation and found no evidence of the cognitive decline or financial incompetence that David and Sarah had reported. Their plan had backfired. Instead of proving I was mentally unfit, they'd created an official record that documented my competence and their willingness to make false reports to government agencies when they didn't get their way. For the first time since this whole nightmare had begun, I had institutional validation that I wasn't the problem in my relationship with David and Sarah. A neutral party with professional expertise had examined our conflict and determined that I was making reasonable decisions while they were making unreasonable accusations. It should have felt like victory, but mostly it felt like profound sadness. Because no matter how wrong they were, no matter how manipulative or cruel their behavior had become, David was still my son. The child I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for had become someone willing to destroy my reputation and risk my autonomy rather than accept that I had the right to say no to his demands. That realization hurt more than all the financial exploitation, more than all the emotional manipulation, more than all the years of being taken for granted and treated like an obligation rather than a person worthy of love and respect. But it also clarified something important. I was dealing with people who would use any weapon available to get what they wanted from me, including my own age and vulnerability. People who would lie to government agencies, exploit my love for my grandchildren, and risk my safety and independence rather than acknowledge my right to protect myself from their exploitation. People like that couldn't be reasoned with or appeased or managed through careful boundaries and diplomatic responses. They could only be stopped. And I was finally ready to stop them. The decision to take legal action wasn't one I made lightly. After 73 years of avoiding conflict, of smoothing over problems rather than confronting them directly, of believing that family disputes should be handled privately rather than through lawyers and courts, the idea of suing my own son felt like stepping off a cliff into empty air. But 4 days after the Adult Protective Services visit, I received a phone call that eliminated any remaining doubt about what I needed to do. Mrs. Thompson, this is Dr. Jennifer Walsh from Chicago General Hospital. Your granddaughter Emma was brought to our emergency department this morning after collapsing at school. She's stable now, but we need to discuss some concerns about her medical care. Emma in the hospital. My 12-year-old granddaughter, who'd been used as a weapon against me just weeks earlier, now sick enough to collapse at school. Every protective instinct I'd developed as a mother and grandmother flooded through me, washing away years of hurt and disappointment in a wave of desperate love. Is she going to be okay? What happened? Emma appears to be suffering from severe anemia caused by malnutrition. Her iron levels are dangerously low, and she shows signs of prolonged inadequate nutrition. We're running additional tests, but initial indicators suggest this has been developing over several months. Malnutrition. In a family with $2 million in assets, my granddaughter was suffering from malnutrition. While David and Sarah traveled to wine country and invested in cryptocurrency, their daughter wasn't getting enough food to maintain her health. Where are her parents? That's part of what I need to discuss with you. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson are currently out of the state on a business trip. We've been unable to reach them, and Emma listed you as her emergency contact. She's been asking for you. David and Sarah were on a business trip while their daughter collapsed from malnutrition. They were traveling for work or pleasure while the child they'd used to guilt me about my selfishness was sick enough to be hospitalized for lack of proper nutrition. I'll be there in 20 minutes, I said, grabbing my purse and keys with hands that shook from adrenaline and rage. Emma looked so small in that hospital bed, surrounded by machines and 4 lines, her face pale against the white pillows. She'd always been tiny for her age, but now she looked fragile in a way that spoke of more than genetics, more than natural build, more than the normal slenderness of active children. Grandma Margaret, she whispered when she saw me, and the relief in her voice broke my heart into sharp pieces that cut with every breath. I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here. I held her hand while Dr. Walsh explained Emma's condition in the hallway outside her room. Severe iron deficiency anemia caused by inadequate nutrition over an extended period. Weight loss indicating prolonged caloric restriction. Blood sugar levels suggesting irregular eating patterns and possible meal skipping. Doctor, I don't understand. Emma's parents are wealthy. They live in an expensive house, drive expensive cars, take expensive vacations. How could she be malnourished? Dr. Walsh's expression was carefully neutral, but her eyes held the kind of concern I'd seen in Karen Mitchell's face when she'd evaluated my living situation. The look of someone who'd seen enough family dysfunction to recognize the signs. Malnutrition in children from affluent families usually indicates neglect rather than poverty, Mrs. Thompson. Sometimes parents become so focused on their own concerns that they fail to monitor their children's basic needs. Sometimes there are substance abuse issues or mental health problems that interfere with caregiving. Sometimes it's simply a matter of priorities. Priorities. I thought about David and Sarah's cryptocurrency investments, their blockchain opportunities, their constant need for more money to fund more investments to generate more wealth that somehow never translated into proper care for their own children. Will Emma be okay? With proper nutrition and iron supplementation, she should recover fully. But Mrs. Thompson, I have to tell you that I'm required to report cases like this to Child Protective Services. Emma's condition suggests ongoing neglect that puts her and possibly her brother at risk. Child Protective Services. The same agency that had investigated me based on David and Sarah's false reports would now investigate them based on Emma's real medical condition. What happens now? Emma will need to stay in the hospital for at least 48 hours while we stabilize her condition and monitor her response to treatment. Someone from CPS will interview her and her parents when they return from their trip. And Emma will need a safe place to recover, somewhere she can receive proper nutrition and supervision. A safe place to recover. I looked through the window at my granddaughter, small and pale and vulnerable, and realized that she needed exactly what I'd been trying to protect for myself: safety from people who claimed to love her but treated her needs as less important than their own desires. She can stay with me, I said without hesitation. For as long as she needs to. Dr. Walsh nodded, making notes in Emma's chart. That would probably be best for her recovery, assuming CPS approves the arrangement. Children heal faster in environments where they feel safe and cared for. Over the next 3 days, while Emma recovered in the hospital and Child Protective Services began their investigation, I learned the full extent of how my son and daughter-in-law had been living while pursuing their investment opportunities. Jake, Emma's 14-year-old brother, revealed during his CPS interview that their parents had been traveling frequently for business opportunities, leaving the children to fend for themselves with minimal supervision and inadequate food budgets. Sarah had been restricting grocery purchases to save money for investments, buying cheap processed foods in small quantities that often ran out before the next shopping trip. The children had been skipping meals regularly, not because their parents couldn't afford food but because proper nutrition had become a lower priority than cryptocurrency investments and real estate opportunities. Emma's malnutrition was the result of months of choosing financial speculation over children's basic needs. David and Sarah returned from their business trip, which social media posts revealed to be a luxury resort vacation in the Bahamas, to find their daughter in the hospital, their son in temporary foster care, and a Child Protective Services investigation that threatened to expose years of neglect disguised as financial ambition. The emergency custody hearing was scheduled for the following Monday, and I decided that weekend that I couldn't stand by and watch my grandchildren suffer while their parents played victim to the consequences of their own choices. I called Daniel Morrison, an attorney I'd found through the Senior Services Directory Karen Mitchell had left me. He specialized in family law and elder abuse cases, and after I explained my situation, he agreed to meet with me on Sunday afternoon to discuss my options. Mrs. Thompson, what you're describing constitutes a pattern of financial elder abuse, followed by retaliation when you refuse to continue enabling their behavior. The false report to Adult Protective Services is particularly serious. It's a form of intimidation designed to silence victims of abuse. Elder abuse? I'd never thought of David and Sarah's treatment of me in those terms, but hearing it defined by a legal professional helped me understand that their behavior wasn't just hurtful or disappointing, it was actually illegal. What can I do about it? Several things. We can file a civil lawsuit seeking return of the money they borrowed under false pretenses, plus damages for the emotional distress they've caused. We can file criminal complaints about the fraudulent APS report and the financial exploitation. And we can petition for custody of your grandchildren if you're willing to provide them with a stable home environment. Custody of Emma and Jake. The possibility hadn't occurred to me, but as Daniel explained the legal process, it began to make sense. The children needed a safe place to live while their parents faced the consequences of their neglect, and I was the obvious alternative to foster care placement. It won't be easy, Mrs. Thompson. Your son and his wife will fight back, probably with expensive lawyers and private investigators. They'll try to portray you as an unfit guardian, too old or too poor or too vindictive to care for children properly. Are you prepared for that kind of battle? I thought about Emma in that hospital bed, about Jake trying to take care of his younger sister while their parents chased investment opportunities in tropical paradises, about the years of manipulation and exploitation and dismissal I'd endured while trying to maintain family relationships that had become toxic to everyone involved. Yes, I said. I'm prepared. The custody hearing was everything Daniel had warned me it would be. David and Sarah arrived with 2 expensive attorneys who portrayed them as devoted parents who'd made temporary mistakes while building financial security for their children's future. They characterized Emma's malnutrition as an unfortunate oversight rather than ongoing neglect, and they painted me as a bitter elderly woman seeking revenge against successful family members. But the medical evidence was clear, and Emma's testimony was devastating. She told the judge about being hungry at school, about eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner when her parents were traveling, about taking care of Jake when he got sick because their parents were too busy with meetings and conference calls to notice. My grandma always made sure I had enough to eat when I visited her, Emma said in her clear 12-year-old voice. She taught me how to cook real food, not just microwave stuff. She never forgot to ask if I was hungry. The judge awarded me temporary custody of both children, with a review hearing scheduled in 6 months to determine permanent placement. David and Sarah were granted supervised visitation rights and ordered to complete parenting classes and financial counseling before unsupervised contact would be considered. As we left the courthouse, David caught up with me in the parking lot, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. I hope you're happy, Mom. You've destroyed our family, turned our own children into weapons against us, probably ruined my career with all this negative publicity. All because you were too selfish to help us when we needed it. Too selfish to help them. After $40,000 stolen, after years of emotional manipulation, after false reports to government agencies, after their children hospitalized from neglect, David still believed I was the problem in our relationship. I didn't destroy your family, David. You did that when you decided that money was more important than the people who loved you. You don't understand what you've done, Sarah added, her voice sharp with the kind of fury that comes from losing control of a situation you thought you could manipulate forever. We'll appeal this decision, we'll prove that you're not capable of caring for our children, we'll show everyone what kind of vindictive person you really are. She was right about one thing, I was vindictive now. After years of accepting unacceptable behavior, of enabling people who saw my love as weakness to be exploited, I'd finally learned to fight back with the same determination they'd used to take advantage of me. You're welcome to try, I said, and my voice was steady and calm and completely unafraid. But this time, you're fighting someone who has nothing left to lose and everything to protect. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but looking back at the woman who'd hidden tears in her kitchen on David's birthday 8 months earlier, I barely recognized her. That woman had been afraid of losing family relationships, terrified of being alone, willing to accept crumbs of affection rather than demand the respect she deserved. This woman, the one standing in the courthouse parking lot facing down the two people who'd spent years exploiting her generosity, was someone entirely different. Someone who'd learned that being alone was better than being used, that protecting yourself was more important than preserving relationships that had become toxic, that saying no to people you loved sometimes meant saying yes to your own dignity. It had taken 73 years and a granddaughter's hospitalization to teach me those lessons, but I'd finally learned them completely. The real test came 6 weeks later, when David and Sarah's expensive attorneys filed an appeal of the custody decision and launched a full legal assault designed to prove I was unfit to care for Emma and Jake. They hired private investigators to examine my finances, looking for evidence of gambling problems or substance abuse or any other issues that might suggest instability. They had me followed for 2 weeks, photographing my grocery shopping trips and doctor's appointments and visits to the library, building a case that my social isolation made me unsuitable as a guardian for active teenagers. They filed motions claiming I was too old and frail to handle the physical demands of caring for children, that my modest apartment was inadequate housing, that my limited income couldn't provide for Emma and Jake's educational and social needs the way their parents' wealth could. Most cruelly, they attempted to use my own grandchildren as witnesses against me, trying to coach Emma and Jake to testify that they missed their parents and wanted to go home, that living with their grandmother was boring and restrictive compared to their previous lifestyle. But Emma and Jake had lived through months of neglect disguised as parental ambition, and they weren't easily manipulated by promises of future attention from parents who'd been too busy chasing investment opportunities to notice their children were going hungry. I don't want to live with Mom and Dad anymore, Jake told the court-appointed guardian during one of his interviews. They're never home, and when they are home, they're always on the phone talking about money. Grandma Margaret actually talks to us like we matter. The investigation that was supposed to prove my unfitness as a guardian instead documented the stability and love I provided for my grandchildren. Social workers noted that Emma's health had improved dramatically in my care, that both children were thriving academically and socially, that our small apartment had become a home where they felt safe and valued. Meanwhile, the investigation into David and Sarah's finances revealed a pattern of risky investments and irresponsible spending that had left them technically wealthy but cash poor, owning millions in assets they couldn't easily liquidate while struggling to meet their monthly expenses without the cryptocurrency windfalls they'd been counting on. Their Bitcoin investments, it turned out, had lost significant value in a market downturn that Daniel Morrison described as predictable to anyone who understood financial markets better than weekend seminars and get-rich-quick schemes. The blockchain startup they'd been so eager to invest in had collapsed amid fraud allegations, taking $50,000 of other people's money with it. The life-changing wealth that had justified years of family exploitation and child neglect was evaporating at the same rate it had been accumulated, leaving David and Sarah with mortgages they couldn't afford, car payments that stretched their monthly budget, and legal bills that were consuming whatever liquid assets they had managed to preserve. The irony was devastating. In their pursuit of riches that would free them from financial worry, they'd created exactly the kind of financial crisis they'd been trying to avoid. And in the process, they'd lost the two things that mattered most, their children's trust and their family's love. The final custody hearing took place on a cold December morning, almost exactly 1 year after Emma had collapsed at school from malnutrition. She sat beside me in the courtroom, healthy and confident and growing into the kind of young woman who spoke up for herself and the people she loved. "Your Honor," she said when given the opportunity to address the court, "I know my parents think they can provide better for Jake and me because they have more money. But Grandma Margaret provides what we actually need, not just what looks good on paper. She makes sure we eat real food every day, she helps us with homework even when she's tired, and she never makes us feel like we're interrupting something more important." The judge's decision was unambiguous: permanent custody to grandmother, with supervised visitation rights for parents contingent on completion of court-mandated counseling and demonstration of stable housing and income sufficient to meet children's basic needs. David and Sarah's dream of easy wealth had cost them everything they claimed to be working for: their children's future, their family relationships, and ultimately, their children themselves. As we walked out of the courthouse that final time, Emma slipped her hand into mine and squeezed tight. "Thank you for protecting us, Grandma. Thank you for teaching me how to protect myself, sweetheart." The apartment that had felt too big and too small when I'd rattled around in it alone had become exactly the right size for the three of us. Emma and Jake shared the bedroom while I slept on a fold-out sofa in the living room, and somehow the space that had echoed with Robert's absence filled with the sound of teenage laughter and homework arguments and the kind of ordinary family chaos I'd thought I'd lost forever. We ate dinner together every night, sitting around my small kitchen table and sharing stories about our days. Emma helped me plan meals that met her nutritional needs while staying within our budget, and Jake discovered he had a talent for cooking that expressed itself in increasingly ambitious weekend breakfast projects. The children learned to navigate a world where money was finite but love was not, where wants were distinguished from needs, where the adults in their lives prioritized their safety and well-being over investment opportunities and financial speculation. For me, caring for Emma and Jake provided something I hadn't realized I'd been missing: a sense of purpose that went beyond survival, a reason to wake up each morning that had nothing to do with my own worries and everything to do with nurturing the next generation. I was needed again, not for what I could provide financially but for what I could offer emotionally: stability, wisdom, unconditional love, and the kind of attention that made children feel valued for who they were rather than what they could contribute to adult agendas. But the most profound change was internal. I'd spent decades of my life measuring my worth by other people's approval, accepting crumbs of affection because I believed that was all I deserved, allowing myself to be diminished by people who should have cherished what I offered. Caring for Emma and Jake, protecting them from parents who'd lost sight of what mattered most, had reminded me of my own value. I wasn't just an old woman with limited resources and outdated opinions. I was someone with wisdom earned through experience, love that had been tempered by loss, strength that had been tested by adversity and proven reliable. The child my son had become couldn't see that value, couldn't appreciate what I'd spent 73 years learning about resilience and sacrifice and the difference between things that matter and things that merely cost money. But Emma and Jake could see it. They thrived in my care not because I could give them everything they wanted, but because I gave them everything they needed: attention, consistency, boundaries, unconditional love, and the security that comes from living with someone who puts children's needs ahead of investment opportunities. Their recovery became my recovery. Their healing became my healing. Their future became the future I'd thought I'd lost when David chose wealth over family, when the little boy I'd raised grew into a man who'd forgotten the difference between success and happiness. I hadn't lost a family when I'd finally stood up to David and Sarah's exploitation. I'd gained one, a smaller family, perhaps, but one built on love rather than obligation, gratitude rather than entitlement, mutual respect rather than one-sided sacrifice. 3 months after the final custody hearing, I received a letter from David that I almost threw away without reading. But curiosity won, and I opened an envelope that contained not the angry recriminations I'd expected but something closer to a confession. "Mom, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I understand why. I've spent the last year thinking about everything that happened, everything I did wrong, everything I lost because I forgot what you and Dad taught me about what matters in life." The letter went on for 3 pages, acknowledging the hurt he'd caused, accepting responsibility for the choices he'd made, asking not for forgiveness but for the possibility that someday, maybe, we might find a way to rebuild some kind of relationship based on honesty rather than manipulation. "Sarah and I are getting divorced. The legal bills and the market losses and the stress of losing the kids destroyed what was left of our marriage. I've taken a job with a smaller firm that pays less but requires fewer hours, and I'm living in a 1-bedroom apartment not far from your neighborhood. I'm hoping that maybe, eventually, I can earn back the right to be part of Emma and Jake's lives again." I showed the letter to Emma and Jake, because decisions about their father affected them most directly. Their responses were different. Emma was cautiously hopeful while Jake remained skeptical, but both agreed that David should have the opportunity to prove he'd changed, as long as the supervised visitation continued and their safety remained the priority. We agreed to meet for coffee at a neutral location, just David and me, to see if there was any foundation left on which to build something new. It was the first time I'd seen him in 8 months, and the changes were startling. The expensive clothes had been replaced by off-the-rack clothing that looked like what he'd worn in college. The confident bearing that had come with wealth and success had given way to something more humble, more uncertain, more like the young man he'd been before money became his primary motivation. "Mom, I need you to know that I understand what I did to you, what I did to Emma and Jake, what I did to our family. There's no excuse for any of it, and I'm not asking you to forgive me or pretend it didn't happen." He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep and everything to do with the exhaustion that comes from finally acknowledging the cost of your own choices. "I started therapy 6 months ago, and I've been working on understanding how I became someone who could treat the people I love the way I treated you. I know it's probably too late to fix most of what I broke, but I want you to know that I'm trying to become the kind of person Dad would have been proud of again." We talked for 2 hours, and for the first time in years, it felt like talking to my son rather than to a stranger who happened to share his face. The conversation was painful and difficult and full of acknowledgments that couldn't undo the damage that had been done, but it was also honest in a way our interactions hadn't been since his childhood. David didn't ask for anything, not money, not custody, not even regular visitation with his children. He simply asked for the possibility that he might, over time, prove worthy of being part of their lives again in whatever capacity they felt comfortable with. "I know I don't have the right to ask for anything from you, Mom. But if you're willing, I'd like to try to be a better son than I've been. Not for what you can do for me, but for what I should have been doing for you all along." I didn't make any promises that day, and neither did he. But I agreed to consider supervised visits with Emma and Jake if they were interested, and I told him he could call me once a month to check in and see how the children were doing. It wasn't forgiveness, that would take much longer, if it ever came at all. It wasn't trust, that had been broken too thoroughly to rebuild quickly. But it was possibility, which was more than I'd thought existed between us just a year earlier. 6 months later, on my 74th birthday, I received 3 cards, one from Emma, who'd drawn a picture of our little family with careful colored pencil, one from Jake, who'd written a poem about grandmothers who were strong enough to protect the people they loved, and one from David, who'd simply written, "Thank you for teaching me what really matters. I'm sorry it took me so long to learn." I kept all 3 cards on my kitchen table while I ate the birthday cake Emma had insisted on baking for me, chocolate with coconut pecan frosting, the same recipe I'd made for David's birthdays when he was small enough to believe that love could be measured in cups of flour and tablespoons of vanilla. This time, though, I knew that love was actually measured in much simpler terms: attention when someone needs you, protection when someone is vulnerable, sacrifice when someone is worth more than your own comfort, and boundaries when someone tries to take more than they're willing to give. It had taken me 73 years to learn that lesson completely, but better late than never. And judging by the recovery I could see in Emma and Jake, by the tentative progress David was making toward becoming a decent man again, the lesson was worth learning no matter how long it took. As I sat in my warm apartment that evening, watching the Chicago skyline light up outside my window, I realized that I'd found something I'd been searching for my entire adult life without knowing it: the perfect balance between caring for others and caring for myself, between being generous and being wise, between loving people and protecting yourself from people who confuse love with exploitation. I'd learned to say no without feeling guilty, to protect my resources without becoming selfish, to set boundaries without building walls. Most importantly, I'd learned that you can love someone completely while refusing to enable their bad choices, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is force people to face the consequences of their actions. Emma was thriving in school, participating in drama club and making friends who came over for weekend sleepovers that filled our small apartment with giggling teenagers and the kind of chaos that meant young people felt safe and welcome. Jake had discovered a talent for music and was learning guitar from Mr. Albright, who'd become an unofficial grandfather figure and helped with everything from homework to household repairs. We'd created our own version of family, one built on choice rather than obligation, strengthened by adversity rather than weakened by it, held together by genuine care rather than financial dependence. And David? David was slowly, carefully, earning his way back into our lives. Not as the entitled son who'd expected unlimited access to his mother's resources, but as a man who'd learned the difference between being given things and earning them. His progress was measured in small gestures: birthday cards that arrived on time, phone calls that asked about our well-being without requesting anything in return, offers to help with household tasks when he came for his monthly supervised visits with the children. He was learning to be present rather than promising to show up later, to listen rather than talking about his own concerns, to contribute rather than taking whatever he wanted and leaving others to deal with the consequences. It might take years before Emma and Jake were ready to trust him completely again, before I could feel confident that his changes were permanent rather than temporary adjustments designed to regain access to what he'd lost. But progress was being made, slowly and carefully and with the kind of deliberate attention that suggested he finally understood what was at stake. The woman who'd hidden tears in her kitchen on David's birthday would barely recognize the person I'd become. That woman had been afraid of conflict, terrified of being alone, willing to accept any treatment rather than risk losing family connections that had become more obligation than joy. This woman, the one raising her grandchildren in a small Chicago apartment, the one who'd learned to fight for herself and the people she loved, the one who discovered that saying no could be an act of love rather than selfishness, was someone I'd never imagined I could become. The transformation hadn't been easy or comfortable or quick. It had required learning skills I'd never needed before, finding courage I'd never known I possessed, accepting losses I'd spent decades trying to avoid. But it had also given me something precious, the understanding that it's never too late to change your life, never too late to demand better treatment from the people around you, never too late to discover strengths you didn't know you had. Most importantly, it had taught me that sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones who teach us the most valuable lessons about our own worth, our own power, our own capacity to survive and thrive even when the world seems determined to diminish us. David and Sarah had tried to make me smaller, quieter, more compliant, more willing to sacrifice myself for their benefit. Instead, they'd forced me to become larger, stronger, more determined, more capable of protecting not just myself but the next generation from the kind of exploitation I'd endured. The grandchildren I was raising would never accept the kind of treatment I'd accepted for decades. They were learning to recognize manipulation, to value themselves appropriately, to distinguish between people who deserved their trust and people who needed to earn it. Emma would never hide tears in a kitchen while someone she loved dismissed her worth. Jake would never loan his life savings to people who had no intention of returning it. They were learning lessons at 12 and 14 that had taken me 73 years to master. That might be the most important gift I could give them, the knowledge that they were valuable, worthy of respect, deserving of love that didn't come with conditions or costs or expectations that they sacrificed their own well-being for other people's convenience. As I write this, it's been almost 2 years since that birthday cake conversation that started my journey towards self-respect. Emma is 14 now, confident and articulate and unafraid to speak up for herself. Jake is 16, thoughtful and creative and determined to build a life based on his own values rather than other people's expectations. David continues his slow progress toward redemption, earning small increases in trust through consistent actions rather than grand promises. He's learned to show up without being asked, to contribute without being told, to apologize without explaining why his mistakes weren't really his fault. Sarah moved to California after the divorce, cutting all contact with her children rather than doing the work necessary to repair relationships she'd helped damage. Her absence has been easier on Emma and Jake than her presence ever was. Sometimes the kindest thing toxic people can do is remove themselves from the lives they've been poisoning. And me? I've discovered that life begins whenever you decide to stop accepting less than you deserve. At 74, I'm healthier and happier and more hopeful than I'd been in decades. I have purpose and meaning and the deep satisfaction that comes from using your hard-won wisdom to protect and nurture people who genuinely need what you have to offer. I've learned to measure wealth in terms of warm apartments and healthy children and neighbors who care enough to fix your furnace without being asked. I've learned that security comes not from bank accounts or investment portfolios but from knowing you can take care of yourself and the people who depend on you. Most of all, I've learned that it's never too late to write a new ending to your story. The woman who started this journey was a victim of other people's greed and selfishness, someone who'd forgotten her own worth in the face of relentless demands for sacrifice and service. The woman who's finishing this journey is someone entirely different, a survivor, a protector, a person who's learned to fight for what matters and let go of what doesn't. You should have tasted what I made for your husband yesterday. Those words were meant to diminish me, to remind me of my place in the hierarchy my daughter-in-law had established, to keep me grateful for whatever crumbs of attention she was willing to share. Instead, they became the first crack in a facade I'd built to protect myself from acknowledging how badly I was being treated. They started a process of awakening that saved not just my own life but the lives of my grandchildren, who were suffering from the same neglect and exploitation that I'd been enduring for years. Sometimes the cruelest words people speak to us become the most important ones we hear, because they force us to finally see what we've been refusing to acknowledge. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most end up being the ones who push us toward the changes we desperately need to make. I don't thank David and Sarah for the pain they caused me, but I'm grateful for the strength I discovered while fighting back against their exploitation. I wouldn't wish the experience on anyone, but I also wouldn't trade the wisdom and confidence and self-respect I gained through surviving it. If you're listening to this story and recognizing pieces of your own experience, if you're nodding along as I describe the gradual erosion of boundaries and the slow acceptance of unacceptable treatment, I want you to know that it's never too late to change your situation. You don't have to accept crumbs while calling them a feast. You don't have to be grateful for attention that comes with conditions and costs. You don't have to sacrifice your own well-being to maintain relationships with people who see your love as weakness to be exploited. You have the right to say no. You have the right to protect yourself. You have the right to demand better treatment from the people in your life, even if those people are family members who claim their demands are motivated by love. Love doesn't require you to impoverish yourself. Love doesn't ask you to risk your security for other people's opportunities. Love doesn't make you choose between your own well-being and maintaining relationships with people who should be protecting you rather than exploiting you. Real love protects. Real love considers your needs alongside its own. Real love doesn't punish you for having boundaries or threaten to abandon you if you refuse unreasonable requests. If the love in your life doesn't feel like love, if it feels like obligation, or fear, or a constant test you're always failing, then it's not love at all. It's something else disguised as love, something that benefits the people demanding it while diminishing the person providing it. You deserve better. You've always deserved better. And it's never too late to start demanding it. Have you ever lived through something similar to what I've shared with you today? Have you ever found yourself accepting less and less while giving more and more, until you barely recognize the person you'd become? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Sometimes sharing our experiences helps other people recognize their own situations more clearly, helps them understand that they're not alone in facing these challenges. And if my story has helped you in any way, if it's given you hope or courage or just the recognition that you're not crazy for feeling like something isn't right in your relationships, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. It will help me reach other people who might need to hear these words, other people who might be ready to stop accepting unacceptable treatment and start fighting for the respect they deserve. Thank you for listening to my heart. Thank you for allowing me to share the most difficult and ultimately most transformative experience of my life. Thank you for being part of a community that believes in the power of truth-telling and the importance of protecting ourselves and the people we love. Your worth isn't determined by what you can give other people or how much you're willing to sacrifice for their benefit. Your value comes from who you are, not what you provide. And you have the right to surround yourself with people who recognize that value and treat you accordingly. It took me 73 years to learn that lesson, but I'm grateful I learned it when I did. It saved my life, and more importantly, it saved my grandchildren's lives too. Sometimes the best thing you can do for the people you love is refuse to enable their worst impulses. Sometimes the most generous gift you can give is the opportunity for them to grow into better versions of themselves by experiencing the consequences of their choices. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is protect yourself so thoroughly that you're still available to help when people are finally ready to accept help rather than demanding exploitation. I hope my story helps you find the courage to write a better ending to your own story. You deserve that ending. And it's never, ever too late to begin.